You recall from an earlier module in this chapter that the only way that we can conditionally run code is by examining the exit status of a particular program. This is how the if statement decides which block of code should get run. Now, if you're a programmer, you might see this as a somewhat limited form of using the if statement. You might be used to seeing constructs like if x is greater than 6, or if a equals b, or something like that. And you might be wondering whether the if statement in shell programming is useful at all, because it doesn't seem to support such notions. Well, there is a way that we can actually do that sort of testing, and we're going to learn about that in this module. Now, the first thing that we need to know about all that is, and this is for the non-programmers, that in general in a programming language it's usually possible to compare two values together and do something based on the result of the comparison. For example, you might want to test two values, and when I say two values I mean either perhaps two variables, or compare a variable with a value and compare them for equality. In other words, is x equal to 6? And do something if it's 6 and do something if it's not 6. We can also test for inequality to see if one is greater than the other, less than, etc., etc. Now, it should be noted that the Bourne shell does not natively support such comparisons. The reason for that is that the Bourne shell really doesn't support the notion of integers at all. You might recall that I mentioned earlier in the module on variables that all variables in the shell are strings. There are no integers, so you can't really say if one is greater than another. However, all is not lost. There is actually another Unix program called test that is perfectly capable of doing such comparisons, and we find that the test program is actually used quite a lot when you're writing shell scripts. Whenever you need this particular sort of comparison, you lean on the test program for that. So let's have a look at how test actually works. Suppose we set a variable called var1 to be 10. Then we can run the test program and we can test whether $var1 equals 20. In other words, we're comparing var1 with 20 to see if they are equal or not. Now, interestingly, test does not produce any output. You don't get a message on the screen telling you whether they're equal or not. All that test does is it changes its exit status according to the results of the comparison. Now, the sharp ones amongst you may be already guessing where this is going. So, what we can do is we can think of this exit status as a true or false value. This is where true and false really start to come into play, and this is the first time that they actually do. In the above example, we say, well, var1 equals 20. That is a test. That is a comparison test. So the statement var1 equals 20 is either true or it's false. And test will return an exit status appropriate to that particular true-false value. In this example, of course, we get a value back of 1, which we've already decided that we're going to treat as false. So let's just do a little visual check on that. Is that statement false? Well, it is, because we've already set var1 to be equal to 10, and 10 does not equal 20. So the statement 10 equals 20 is, of course, false. If var1 was originally set to 20, then the exit status of the test in that example would be 0, which of course would mean true. Now, as many of you will have already guessed, test was actually designed for specific use with the if statement, and here's an example of how you might use that. You might have a variable called var1, and you might have another variable called, let's say, max, and we can test them using the -gt option. -gt means greater than, gt for greater than. So we read this, we say if var1 is greater than max, then we can say, well, that value is too large because it's greater than the maximum. So as you can see, this is actually a very handy way. It is slightly long-winded, but it is a handy way of comparing two values. Sadly, we can't use the greater than symbol. The greater than symbol is already used by the shell program to redirect output to a file, as you probably already know. Now, a couple of notes when using test. These are quite important. I really think that you should keep these in mind, or you'll get all sorts of errors in your scripts. The first is, it's the spaces around the equal sign. You absolutely must have spaces around both sides of the equal sign. If you don't have them, it certainly will not work as expected. Now this is somewhat confusing because when you assign one variable to another, or when you assign a value to a variable, you absolutely must have no spaces around either side of the equal sign. So it might seem to be inconsistent. It's not really, because when you're assigning variables, that's done using the shell, and when you're comparing variables, that's done using the test program. So they're actually different programs. And the second note is that if the variable has actually not been set at all, or has been set to nothing, in other words, you might just type in x equals and then just press enter on the command line, which will set the value of x to nothing at all, then if you actually use that variable with test in some sort of comparison, you'll get a syntax error. Let me show you a demonstration of that before I show you how you can actually fix it. So suppose I have a variable called x and I just set it to nothing like that. That actually works. There's no error involved in that. It's just x is now equal to nothing. So now I can say test x equals 20 and I get an error message. Now it's a very subtle thing, but I'd like to actually explain why we're getting an error message here. You have to understand that before test even gets to have a look at this command line, the shell gets in and processes the values involved. In other words, the shell will look to see if there are any special characters on that line, and it finds one with the $sign, and it says, aha, there's a $sign. So that means instead of actually having the $x there, I'm going to replace that with the value of the variable called x. And what is in x? Yes, well, you guessed it, nothing at all. So it actually, if you like, you can think about it as the shell comes along and actually just removes the $x from that line in this particular example. Or to put it another way, it replaces it with nothing at all. And so all test sees is the following line, test equals 20, and that's all. It doesn't see the $x, it doesn't see anything. So that's obviously some kind of syntax error for test. It's expecting something to be made equal to 20. So let's now have a look at how we can fix that.